In a cold government archive just outside Washington, D.C., a small unmarked box quietly disappeared from the catalogue in 1973, yet the archivists sworn to guard it insist they never saw such a box at all. Inside, according to a lone witness, were reports detailing operations the United States government has never admitted existed. And this is not an anti-America video. It's a story about how a great nation sometimes steps into the shadows believing it's the only way to protect itself. But if these secrets were meant to stay buried forever, what force was powerful enough to drag them into the light now? And more importantly, where did this darkness truly begin? To answer that, we have to go back to the moment America built an agency born from fear. Chapter 1. The Shadow Born in Fear. On a quiet winter morning in 1946, a young Wills officer named Thomas Reed stepped off a train in Ohio, expecting to return to a country basking in victory. But as he walked through his hometown, he didn't see celebration, he saw uncertainty. Storefront radios whispered about Soviet troop movements. Newspapers spoke of a new kind of enemy, one without borders or uniforms, and in the eyes of the neighbors who used to greet him with pride, he saw something he had never witnessed in America before. Fear. Not the fear of bombs or battlefields, but of something far more unsettling, an enemy no one could see coming. Thomas would later write in his journal, "We won the war, but somehow the world feels less safe than when I left." From that moment, his personal anxiety echoed a deeper shift happening across the nation. The United States had emerged from World War II as a global superpower, yet it felt curiously alone. The Soviet Union, once an ally of necessity, now loomed as a shadow stretching across Europe. American parents began hearing new vocabulary on the evening news: Iron Curtain, espionage, atomic secrets. The country that once defined itself through openness and optimism now found itself wrestling with a disorienting truth: freedom is fragile. One leaked blueprint, one stolen document, one defector's confession could change the balance of the entire world. Washington responded not with parades, but with policies. Congressional committees launched investigations into suspected communists. Universities added courses on Russian ideology. Even Hollywood rewrote its scripts to reflect a nation suddenly obsessed with infiltration and subversion. This was not paranoia in isolation, it was an emerging system of fear woven directly into American culture. Between 1946 and 1950, the number of FBI domestic surveillance cases increased more than fivefold. Headlines framed espionage as a silent epidemic, and for many Americans, the threat no longer came from armies abroad, but from whispers inside their own borders. For Thomas Reed and thousands like him, the emotional toll was private but profound. Soldiers who once fought on clear battlefields now faced an enemy who operated through secrets, not soldiers. Parents lay awake wondering whether their children were living through the opening chapters of another world war. Politicians argued that America must act first or risk losing everything. A sense of moral certainty central to the American identity began to fracture. If protecting freedom required new powers, new surveillance, new secrecy, then what did freedom truly mean? And how far would the nation go to defend it? Out of this climate, this mixture of pride, fear, and unspoken desperation came the idea that America needed something it had never built before: a permanent intelligence agency, one capable of fighting an enemy that would never declare Washington. A system born not in celebration, but in uncertainty, not in the sunlight of victory, but in the long shadow of a world divided overnight. And yet, as the ink dried on the National Security Act of 1947, almost no one outside Washington understood the magnitude of what had just been created. For in the name of protecting freedom, America was about to unleash something T had lived outside the light. On a humid summer evening in 1947, in a small apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the Rosenfeld family gathered around their radio. The "Why" expected the usual post-war news: economic recovery, new housing developments, the baseball scores. Instead, they heard a report that froze the room. Several top German scientists, once loyal to Hitler's regime, had quietly been brought to the United States, not as prisoners, not as defendants, but as government employees for Samuel Rosenfeld, who had lost his parents in a concentration camp. The idea felt impossible. He whispered, almost to himself, "How can the country that saved us now give shelter to the men who built the machines that killed my family?" His daughter remembered that moment for the rest of her life. The way her father's hands trembled as if the past had suddenly stepped back into the room. But that shock, that emotional rupture inside one Jewish living room, reflected a much larger tension that was swallowing America from the inside out. As the Cold War deepened, Washington began to believe that German scientific knowledge might determine the future of global power. The Soviet Union was racing for rockets, jet propulsion, chemical warfare advances, technologies that could decide who ruled the skies and who ruled the world. American military officials feared that if the US didn't take these scientists, Moscow would. And in a climate where fear had become policy, morality became negotiable. Operation Paperclip emerged. From this collision of fear and ambition. On paper, US immigration laws prohibited former Nazi Party members from entering the country. But behind closed doors, government officials altered files, removed incriminating details, and rewrote histories. Werner von Braun, a key architect of Hitler's V-2 rocket program, arrived in America with a sanitized dossier. More than 1,600 German scientists would follow. This wasn't speculation, it's documented in declassified memos where military officers explicitly instructed staff to cleanse records to ensure entry approval. The system was end-bending. It was being rebuilt to accommodate an entirely new version of national security. And while America's strategic calculation was clear, the human consequences were deeply personal. Families, like the Rosenfelds, saw the move as a betrayal of justice. Holocaust survivors walked the streets of New York, knowing that the men who engineered their suffering were now walking the streets of Alabama, Texas, and New Mexico under U.S. protection, drawing U.S. salaries, shaping U.S. futures. For many Americans, especially the immigrant communities who had looked to the U.S. as a moral compass in a broken world, this was the first moment they questioned whether the nation they trusted could betray its own ideals in the shadows. Yet in Washington, a different narrative took root, one built on urgency and the belief that survival required compromise. Leading officials argued that the Cold War was not just a geopolitical struggle, but a technological race where losing could mean annihilation to them. Paperclip was a necessary evil, a strategic maneuver to prevent Soviet dominance. In the halls of the Pentagon, the moral discomfort felt in homes like the Rosenfelds seemed distant, almost abstract. As one army scientist wrote in 1948, "We are not hiring Nazis, we are hiring minds that can keep America alive." But that sentence captured the core fracture emerging inside the American identity. Was the nation built on moral leadership, or on whatever it took to win? Paperclip didn't just reshape the US scientific landscape, it reshaped how America understood itself. It taught the government that secrecy could justify anything, and that the public did not need to know the cost of survival. It set a precedent, a blueprint for future decisions where national security would outweigh accountability, transparency, and even justice. On a cold November night in 1953, inside a modest cabin in rural Maryland, Alice Olsen waited for her husband, Frank, to return from what he described as a routine work retreat. She had set the table, warmed dinner, and left the porch light glowing in the darkness. But the man who stepped through the door that evening was not the husband. She knew. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for threats no one else could see. His hands trembled when she touched his arm. And when their young son asked if he was okay, Frank F. Auster smiled so strained it frightened everyone at the table. Alice would later describe that night as the moment my husband came home, but the world he came from followed him through the door. At first, his behavior seemed like exhaustion, the kind that came from classified government work he could never fully explain. But in truth, Frank Olsen had just become one of the earliest and willing subjects of a secret CIA program that saw human consciousness not as something sacred, but as a battlefield. Days earlier, at a secluded meeting, his colleagues slipped LSD into his drink. Why? Thought his knowledge an experiment meant to test how the human mind could be manipulated, rewritten, or fractured. What happened to Frank was not an accident, it was policy, born from the same cold war logic that justified Operation Paperclip. If America didn't seize control of the future of psychological warfare, the Soviets would. From Frank's living room, the story widens. NTO, a system so sprawling it defies belief. MK-Ultra wasn't one experiment, it was a network of more than 150 covert sub-projects operating under the CIA's technical services staff. Hospitals, universities, prisons, and private clinics became laboratories where doctors, some unwitting and some fully aware, tested drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even electroshock therapy at intensities far beyond accepted medical practice. One congressional hearing later revealed that at least one experiment attempted to erase a person's identity through extended isolation and forced drugging. Under the umbrella of national security, the boundaries of consent, ethics, and humanity collapsed, and the cultural contrast struck at the heart of what America believed about itself. This was the land of the free, a nation that celebrated individual liberty as a foundational truth, yet its own government operated a program designed to fracture that liberty at its most intimate level, the human mind. It wasn't simply the secrecy that stunned the public once the details emerged. It was the realization that their government had crossed a psychological line no democratic society should ever approach. MK-Ultra exposed a deeper contradiction, that fear, when institutionalized, could justify almost anything, even experimenting on the very citizens a government vowed to protect. For the Olsen family, the consequences were shattering. 9 days after the LSD exposure, Frank Olsen was pushed from a hotel window in New York City. Officials claimed it was suicide. His family, kept in the dark for decades, came to believe otherwise. Their grief turned into distrust, their trust into anger, and their anger into a lifelong battle to uncover the truth. And as their story spread across America, thousands of other citizens began questioning what else might have been hidden behind the walls of national security. How many lives were altered? How many minds were broken? In the name of protection, MK-Ultra revealed that the most dangerous battleground of the Cold War wasn't in Berlin, Korea, or Cuba, it was inside the human psyche. And once the government learned how to manipulate perception, behavior, and fear itself, the question was no longer whether minds could be controlled, but how many and to what end. If the mind could be controlled, then so could an entire nation. On a warm August evening in 1981, in a small Iranian cafe tucked between two Persian grocery stores in Los Angeles, an elderly man named Far had unrolled a faded newspaper clipping on the table. His daughter, Layla, watched quietly as he traced the edges of the photo Mohammad Mossadegh standing proudly before the Iranian parliament in 1951. the year he nationalized Iran's oil. Farhad's voice trembled when he whispered, "He was our hope." Until the day your uncle disappeared, 4 families like his, exiles scattered across California after the revolution. Mossadegh wasn't just a political figure. He was a symbol of the future Iran never got to have. And sitting beside them, listening like a student of history pulled back into the past, was Thomas Reed, now retired and far removed from the shadows of his Horse days. He found himself confronting a truth he had spent decades avoiding. The very fear-driven decisions that shaped his career had helped ignite a chain of events that reshaped an entire region. As Farhad spoke, Thomas realized the Cold War wasn't just a contest of ideologies, it was a series of choices that crossed oceans and broke nations. From that Los Angeles cafe, the story pulls back into the geopolitical machinery of early 1950s Washington. Iran, newly democratic and led by Mossadegh, sought to reclaim control of its oil from the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. To many Iranians, it was a patriotic, economic, and moral necessity. But to American and British officials, it threatened the balance of global power, fearing Iran might drift toward the Soviet Union or inspire other nations to challenge Western control. The CIA and MI6 launched Operation Ajax, a covert mission to topple Mossadegh. This was not speculation. It is documented in declassified CIA files released in 2013, which openly acknowledged US involvement in orchestrating protests, bribing Iranian politicians, and disseminating propaganda. What began as whispers in embassy hallways became a full-scale psychological and political operation. Streets were flooded with hired mobs, newspapers print fabricated stories, and military officers were paid to switch allegiance. The world saw chaos. Behind the scenes, it was choreography, but for Iranian families like Farhad's, the consequences were devastating. His brother, a university student and vocal supporter of Mossadegh, vanished during the unrest. Their mother searched hospitals, police stations, and detention centers 4 months before accepting the truth: he wasn't coming home. This isn't just history. It is the emotional residue that exile communities in America still carry. Their belief in democracy, the very value the United States claimed to defend, was shattered by the nation that overthrew their own. Thomas, hearing these stories, felt the weight of contradiction that defines so much of Cold War America. At home, the US championed freedom, elections, and self-determination. Abroad, it destabilized any government that challenged Western interests. As Farhad put it that night, America preached freedom, but exported fear. And in that sentence lay the moral fault line stretching across decades of US foreign policy. The coup succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah was reinstated, and Iran's democracy was replaced by an autocratic regime backed by Washington. This single victory, celebrated quietly in CIA headquarters, created a blueprint for future interventions. It taught American intelligence that foreign governments could be moved like pieces on a chessboard, and that democratic rule was negotiable if it conflicted with strategic interests. In the cafe, Thomas finally understood why the stories of Paperclip and MK Ultra felt incomplete without acknowledging what came next: the exportation of fear as a tool of national strategy. Iran 1953 wasn't just a coup. It was the beginning of a pattern and method America would repeat across continents, leaving behind broken systems and broken families. This was only the beginning. A pattern was forming. For a long moment in that small Los Angeles cafe, none of us spoke. The story of Mossadegh's fall hung in the air like a storm cloud that had never fully cleared. Even after 3 decades, Thomas Reed sat forward, elbows on the table, the weight of everything he'd heard resting heavy on his shoulders. He had lived through the first era of the Cold War, trained to believe he That secrecy was protection and intervention was necessity. But listening to Farhad's trembling voice, he felt something he never allowed himself to feel during his years in intelligence doubt. What had all of it really protected? And at what cost? Layla leaned in, her tone soft but edged with grief. She described the day her family fled Iran in 1979, carrying only 2 suitcases and a silver framed photo of her uncle, the brother who vanished. In the chaos of 1953, she remembered her mother clutching that frame as the plane lifted off, whispering, "If Mossadegh had lived, maybe we would still have a home." It was not nostalgia speaking, but the echo of a democracy interrupted before it had the chance to grow roots. For exiled Iranians across California from Orange County to Westwood, the coup wasn't just a historical event, it was the fracture that set their entire lives on a different trajectory. Thomas recognized the pattern instantly. It mirrored the emotional fallout he had seen inside America's own borders after MKUltra. Distrust, disillusionment, the quiet heartbreak of learning that the government you believed in had not believed in you. But in Iran, that heartbreak collapsed a nation. After the coup, the Shah's regime tightened its grip. Political prisoners filled jails. The secret police, SAVAK, trained with American backing, became synonymous with torture, and the ideal of a democratic Middle East, one chosen by its people rather than shaped by foreign hands, was extinguished before the world even understood what had happened to W. Ashington. However, the coup was hailed as a triumph. Newly declassified documents reveal CIA officers celebrating the success of restoring stability and ensuring Western access to oil. In closed meetings, officials framed Operation Ajax as proof that America could shape global events without ever sending in troops. It was clean, quiet, and effective, everything Cold War strategists believed modern conflict should be. But beneath that polished narrative lay the truth Farhad had carried for decades, that America's victory was built on another nation's broken trust. This contradiction between American ideals and American actions shaped the era more profoundly than most citizens ever realized. At home, Americans grew up believing their nation was a beacon of self-determination, a defender of democracy. Abroad, the US made decisions that suggested a very different priority: control, influence, leverage, the belief that freedom was universal, but stability was American, that the US could export fear, while preaching freedom, as Farhad said earlier, became a quiet mantra of Cold War foreign policy. For Iranians in exile, the consequences were deeply personal. They built new lives in the United States, sent their children to American schools, learned English with thick accents and heavier memories. Yet they lived every day knowing their homeland, its politics, its culture, its fate had been reshaped by men in another country who never met them, never saw their families, never walked the streets their ancestors had built. Layla once asked Thomas, "How can a country claim to believe in democracy while destroying ours?" He had no answer. The truth was too complex, too tangled in decades of fear and power. But her question lingered, carving itself into the silence like a wound that refused to close. And for Thomas, that night marked a turning point. He realized that the same forces that once justified paperclip and fueled MKUltra had tended far beyond America's borders. They had crossed oceans, tipped governments, and rewritten destinies. Iran 1953 wasn't an isolated operation, it was the first chapter in a new doctrine of American influence, one that would soon reach Guatemala, Congo, Chile, and dozens of nations caught in the gravitational pull of the Cold War. The pattern was becoming clear. The shadows created to protect America were no longer confined to defense, they were shaping the world. 4 days after that conversation in the Los Angeles cafe, Thomas Reed carried Farhad's story him like a weight he couldn't set down. He replayed the details: the vanished brother, the family forced into exile, the hope extinguished before it had a chance to breathe, and somewhere along the way, he began confronting an uncomfortable truth. The coup in Iran didn't just reshape one nation, it reshaped America too, molding its identity into something more complicated than the heroic narrative he grew up with. The shadows weren't just abroad, they had seeped back into the American psyche, quietly altering how the nation understood its purpose in the world. A few evenings later, Thomas met Layla again, this time at a quiet park, overlooking the Pacific. She held a small leather-bound journal, her father's writings, collected over decades. Leafing through the pages, she read a passage written in 1964. Iran was not lost in a single day. It was lost in every silent moment where a foreign hand chose for us, where our voice no longer mattered. She paused, her breath catching. This is how he taught me to understand the coup, she said. Not as one event, but as a slow unraveling of trust. Watching her speak, Thomas felt the same ache he had seen years earlier in the victims of MK people whose lives split into a before and an after without their permission. In Iran's case, the split happened on a national scale. After Mossadegh's removal, the Shah's grip tightened, dissent was crushed, and political fear became part of daily life. But in American newspapers, the story was framed as a strategic win. Editorials praised US leadership, describing Iran as stabilized. The public, still adapting to the anxieties of the Cold War, accepted the explanation without knowing what had been traded away. They trusted that their government acted in the name of freedom, unaware that freedom had been selectively defined. To understand why the story landed that way, Thomas revisited his own memories of the era. In the early 1950s, America was a nation obsessed with the idea of losing ground to communism, to Soviet influence, to the chaos of a post-war world. Fear was not merely an emotion. It was a political language spoken fluently in congressional hearings, radio broadcasts, and counterintelligence briefings. In that climate, moral lines blurred easily. If removing one democratically elected leader stopped the spread of communism, then the action was rationalized as protecting the greater good. The American public, raised on the belief that their nation was the world's guardian, rarely questioned the cost of those victories. But for Iranians like Farhad and Layla, the cost was everything. Their democracy, still fragile and young, had been derailed by forces they never voted for, never invited, never even saw. Their homeland, its culture, its hopes, its political future became collateral in a war of ideologies fought between two superpowers. When Layla opened her father's journal again, she turned to a page written shortly after they arrived in the US. America is the land I fled to, but not the hand I would have chosen to shape my country. Those words struck Thomas with the force of a confession, exposing the fracture at the heart of US foreign policy, a nation that preached self-determination while denying it to others. And yet, even with all he had learned, Thomas couldn't escape the thought that had haunted America's intelligence community for decades. What if they hadn't intervened? What if Iran had aligned with the Soviet Union? What if the Cold War had tilted in the other direction? These were the questions that allowed policymakers to justify almost anything. Questions built on fear, not certainty, on possibility, not evidence. And fear, Thomas now realized, had guided far more decisions than truth ever had. Meanwhile, for the Iranian diaspora in California, life was a constant navigation between past and present. They built businesses, raised families, celebrated Nowruz in backyards lit with string lights, but the shadow of 1953 never fully receded. Every conversation about Iranian politics eventually traced back to the coup. Every generational debate, parents clinging to memory, children negotiating identity, sat atop that single rupture. Even in America, thousands of miles away, the consequences traveled with them like an inherited scar. Thomas felt that scar too, not as a victim, but as a witness waking up to the scale of what had been done in the name of security. He realized that the patterns revealed by Paperclip, MKUltra, and now Iran were not isolated mistakes. They were the architecture of a new American doctrine, one where covert action replaced diplomacy, where reshaped policy, and where the line between defending democracy and dismantling it grew dangerously thin. And as he stood watching the sun dip into the Pacific, he understood something else. The coup in Iran wasn't just history, it was the template for a future that was already unfolding across the globe. In the weeks after his conversations with Farhad and Layla, Thomas Reed found himself unable to sleep. Iran had opened a door he couldn't close, a realization he couldn't escape. If the CIA had reshaped one democracy so decisively, how many other nations had been pushed, pulled, or toppled without the world fully understanding why? One evening, while sorting through his old ORS notebooks, he found a worn folder labeled Latin America, Briefings, 1954. The edges had yellowed, but the memory it carried was painfully sharp. It brought him back to a story he had tried to forget, one that began thousands of miles south of California, in a Guatemalan village, surrounded by coffee fields and poverty. Thomas remembered the first time he met a Guatemalan farmer named Mateo in the late 1960s. They crossed paths at a church shelter in Mexico, where displaced families gathered after violence tore through their homes. Mateo's voice was soft, but the grief behind it was overwhelming. He told Thomas about the morning soldiers arrived during the coup of 1954, how gunfire erupted at sunrise, how his father tried to shield the family, how the world he knew collapsed in a single day. What haunted Thomas most wasn't just the tragedy, but the quiet resignation in Mateo's words. We were pieces on a board. Someone far away decided our fate. From that single moment of human suffering, the story expands into the geopolitical machinery driving the decade. After Iran, Washington had embraced a new logic. If one country fell to communism, others would follow like dominoes. The fear spread through government halls with such intensity that it overshadowed nuance, culture, and sovereignty. In Guatemala, democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz implemented land reforms to break up monopolies held by foreign corporations, most notably the United Fruit Company, a powerful American entity with deep political ties to US officials. This wasn't domestic policy, it was the first tremor of communism in the Western Hemisphere. Documents declassified decades later show how the CIA pursued a strategy almost identical to Operation Ajax: psychological warfare, radio broadcasts spreading misinformation, the training of Latin American mercenaries, and carefully staged revolts designed to appear organic. The operation was so meticulously orchestrated that the Guatemalan military surrendered under the belief they were facing an enormous invading force, when in truth, it was little more than a small CIA-backed militia amplified by propaganda. With Arbenz overthrown, Guatemala entered decades of instability, violence, and civil war conflicts that claimed more than 200,000 lives. For families like Mateo's, the coup wasn't a political headline. It was the event that stole their homes, fractured their communities, and forced them into a lifetime of displacement. But Guatemala was not the only domino. In the early 1960s, CIA focus shifted to the Congo, where newly independent Congo's first democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, sought control over his country's vast mineral wealth. The US feared Soviet influence in the region and saw Lumumba's ambitions as a threat to Western access to strategic resources. In a move that mirrored the pattern established in Iran and Guatemala, the CIA supported factions that ultimately led to Lumumba's capture and assassination. Declassified memos show American officials discussing his removal, with chilling detachment, treating the fate of a nation as a logistical obstacle. Once again, Thomas saw the same themes repeating: fear-driving policy, morality sacrificed to strategic calculus, and human lives reduced to abstract pieces on a global chessboard. For many Americans at the time, these operations were invisible. Newspapers painted simplified narratives, casting interventions as necessary steps to prevent the spread of communism. The domestic belief in America as the protector of global freedom remained largely intact. Citizens weren't told about the farms burned in Guatemala, the children orphaned in Congo, or the thousands of families exiled from homes they never saw again. Yet for the people who lived through these covert wars, the consequences last generations. Mateo never returned to his village. Lumumba's children grew up hearing stories of a father taken from them not by enemies within, but by forces beyond their borders. Entire nations learned to see the United States not as a beacon of freedom, but as a distant power capable of reshaping their destinies without ever stepping into the sunlight. And for Thomas, the truth became impossible to ignore. These weren't isolated incidents, they were the architecture of a strategy, the blueprint of a doctrine born from fear. Iran had been the first test, Guatemala the co-information, Congo the escalation. The pattern he traced across his memories and the testimonies of those he met revealed a simple but devastating truth. Once America learned it could topple governments in shadows, the shadows began to grow. But covert action doesn't stay covert forever. Long after his conversations with Mateo and the Iranian family, Thomas found himself revisiting a simple but unsettling truth. The places touched by covert action did not simply return to normal, they unraveled. The coup was never the end of the story. It was the spark that lit a fire no one bothered to control, and nowhere was this more evident than in the ripple effects that spread across Latin America and Africa throughout the 1960s. These were not ripples caused by chance, they were waves born from deliberate choices. One afternoon, Thomas visited a small community center in East Los Angeles, where immigrant families gathered for language classes and mutual aid. There, he met Mateo, again, older now, with deep creases etched into his face like a map of every loss he had carried. Mateo introduced him to a group of young Guatemalan migrants who had fled decades after the coup, their lives still shaped by the violence that followed the collapse of their democracy. One young man, barely in his 20s, unrolled a sketch of the village where he was born, a place he left after paramilitary squads swept through, burning homes and dragging away anyone suspected of sympathizing with the opposition. "This is the only version that still exists," he said. Quietly, "the real one is gone." Hearing this, Thomas felt a familiar heaviness, the same weight he carried after learning about MKUltra. The same guilt that surfaced when he listened to Farhad describe his brother's disappearance. Different continents, different decades, different cultures, but the pattern was identical. Where America intervened, societies fractured. Where America installed stability, people disappeared. Where America claimed to protect freedom, communities were shattered in the name of preventing a threat that often never existed. Pulling back from the lives of these individuals, Thomas reflected on the larger ideological engine driving it all, the domino theory. In Washington, the idea spread like gospel: if one nation adopted socialism or drifted towards Soviet influence, its neighbors would fall in succession. Maps were drawn in briefing rooms, with arrows tracing hypothetical collapses across continents. Politicians used the theory to justify budgets, covert operations, and alliances. American culture absorbed this narrative through movies, presidential speeches, classroom textbooks, and nightly news broadcasts. Citizens began to believe that the fate of the free world depended on distant countries they couldn't locate on a map. Yet few Americans ever understood what the implementation of that theory looked like on the ground. They didn't see the mercenaries recruited from Honduras, Nicaragua, and Colombia. Men offered money, weapons, and promises of power. They didn't witness the psychological operations designed to pit neighbor against neighbor, turning entire villages into battlegrounds of suspicion. They didn't hear the coded radio broadcasts the CIA used to stage fake uprisings or read the leaflets drive opt from planes to convince civilians that their government had already fallen. Thomas remembered one briefing from 1962 back when he still worked adjacent to intelligence circles. A young analyst had presented a plan to manipulate tribal leaders in the Congo by controlling their access to food and medical supplies. The room reacted not with concern, but with strategic interest. If it works, someone said, we can replicate it elsewhere. In that moment, Thomas realized the terrifying simplicity of the logic. When nations become chess pieces, people become pawns. Their lives are variables in an equation. Their suffering an acceptable margin of error. Meanwhile, back in the community center, Mateo's group spoke about the long arc of violence in Guatemala. How his CIA-backed coup had led to a 36-year civil war. How more than 40,000 people disappeared. How many were indigenous farmers caught between military forces and rebel groups. These men didn't carry government documents or political ideology. They carried memories of smoke rising from their fields, of mothers searching for sons who never returned, of stories whispered at night, because the wrong sentence could invite death. For Thomas, the contrast between American perception and global reality became painfully clear. In the US, the 60s were remembered as a decade of civil rights, arches, rock music, space exploration, and national pride. Abroad, they were remembered as the decade when the world's most powerful democracy manipulated governments, armed factions, and reshaped borders under the banner of prevention. We believed we were saving the world, Thomas thought, but we never stopped to ask who the world belonged to. As he parted ways with Mateo and the others that evening, Thomas knew he was now seeing history without the comforting filter he had once relied on. The dominoes had fallen exactly as predicted, but not because communism spread across continents. They fell because fear drove a superpower to tip them. And somewhere deep down, Thomas sensed that the shadows cast by these secret wars were growing too large to contain. Even the architects of covert power could not predict the consequences that were already beginning to surface. In the days following his visit to the community center, Thomas felt as though he were walking rough to parallel Americas. One was the America he had served in his youth, confident, righteous, convinced it was the world's moral compass. The other was a quieter, heavier America, one he had only begun to see after speaking with people like Mateo and Farhad, an America whose shadow extended far beyond its borders, leaving behind wounds that few citizens ever recognized. And the more Thomas listened to the voices of those displaced by covert wars, the more sharply that Second America came into focus. A few evenings later, he was invited to a gathering at the home of a Congo Lee's family in Inglewood. They had heard through a network of immigrant communities that he was seeking to understand what US intervention truly looked like from the ground. When Thomas arrived, he found a small living room crowded with people, seated on mismatched chairs, sharing dishes of spicy stew and stories spoken in soft French and Lingala. One elderly man named Kanku held a faded PH autograph of Patrice Lumumba, his country's first prime minister, the man whose assassination reshaped the Congo forever. Kanku's voice quivered as he described the night his village elders announced Lumumba's death. We did not know the details then, he said, but we knew it was not our choice. Someone else decided our future. The room fell still. Even decades later, the loss felt present, like an old bruise that still ached when touched. Kanku looked at Thomas with eyes that held no anger, only sorrow. You must understand, he whispered, the death of one man It came the death of hope for millions. Hearing this, Thomas recognized the same emotional current that ran through every story he had encountered since reopening this part of his past, a deep, almost generational grief. Whether in Guatemala, Iran, or Congo, the pattern repeated itself. American intelligence intervened, a nation lost its voice, and ordinary people paid the price. The similarities were to PR's to ignore, to consistent to dismiss as coincidence. This was not improvisation, it was policy, shaped by a worldview that saw global stability as something best engineered from Washington. Pulling back from these individual stories, Thomas traced the political logic of the era. During the 1950s and 60s, the United States operated under a simple but powerful assumption: communism spread not through ideas but through momentum. One nation falling increased the likelihood that its neighbors would fall, too. To stop that momentum, the US engaged not in open warfare but in the manipulation of governments, resources, and leaders. Declassified files from the Congo revealed chilling details. CIA operatives surveilled Lumumba, intercepted his communications, and supplied our rival factions with financial and logistical support. One memo noted that preventing Lumumba's rise was a high priority for maintaining Western influence in Africa's mineral-rich regions. In other words, democracy mattered, but access mattered more. The same logic had justified Guatemala. The same logic would soon shape Vietnam. And the same logic, Thomas realized, had been taught to him in subtle, almost invisible ways when he was a young OSS officer. That in the great chessboard of the Cold War, morality was a luxury, but influence was survival. As he listened to the Congolese families at night, Thomas found himself comparing their memories to those he had heard from Mateo's group. Different languages, different histories, yet the stories rhymed. A father disappearing after a military sweep. A school burned because rebels were rumored to be hiding there. Mothers carrying children across borders, hoping the next country would offer peace. The tragedies were not identical, but the architecture behind them, the machinery of destabilization, felt unmistakably familiar. And yet, back in the United States, during the same decade, most Americans experienced a completely different reality. The 60s were remembered for civil rights marches, the moonshot, the Cultural Revolution. The concept of secret wars happening across continents was barely visible to the public. Politicians reassured Americans that intervention abroad protected democracy, even as they quietly undermined it overseas. The country lived with a split identity: idealism at home, interference abroad, and few recognized the contradiction unless they had been directly touched by it. For Thomas, that duality had become impossible to ignore. He began to understand why so many immigrant communities approached history with skepticism, because they had lived through the gap between American rhetoric and American action. And as he walked to his car that night, he realized that every story he had heard from Iran, from Guatemala, from the Congo was preparing him for the darkest chapter yet. A chapter where the United States would no longer just assist from the shadows, but plunge itself fully into a war shaped by fear, strategy, and a belief in the domino theory taken to its most brutal extreme. On a grey California morning in 1983, Thomas Reed sat quietly in a dimly lit church basement in San Diego, where a support group for Vietnam veterans met every Thursday. The room smelled faintly of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the chairs were arranged in a loose circle. Across from him sat a man, Jack Harlan, a former Marine turned CIA asset during the war. His hands shook slightly as he lit another cigarette, the flame reflecting in his tired eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent decades trying to escape memories that refused to fade. Phoenix wasn't a program, he murmured. It was a machine, and we were the gears. From that single sentence, Tom has felt the room shift. Jack recounted the night in 1968 when he led a small unit into a village outside Da Nang. Intelligence claimed a Viet Cong cadre was hiding there. "We were told it would save lives," Jack said. "But when we left, the only thing alive was the fire." His words trembled, not from anger, but from shame, the kind that settles deep in the bones, the kind that cannot be outrun. And as Thomas listened, he realized this was the closest he had ever been to understanding what America's shadow wars looked like when stripped of strategy and policy and viewed only through human eyes. Pulling back fro, Jack's memories, the wider machinery of the era, came into focus. Vietnam had become the Cold War's proving ground, a place where theories crafted in Washington were tested on real villages, real families, real lives. The Phoenix program, officially described as an intelligence-led initiative to dismantle Viet Cong infrastructure, evolved into something far more brutal. Declassified records estimate over 20,000 people were killed under the program, many based on faulty intelligence, personal vendettas, or coerced confessions. CIA advisors trained South Vietnamese units in interroga, tie-in techniques that blurred the line between questioning and torture. Blacklists grew longer, due process vanished. In the name of counterinsurgency, Vietnam became a laboratory where moral boundaries dissolved. The collision of American values and the reality of the war created a cultural tension that still lingers today. Back home, Americans grew up believing their country fought for liberty and justice, but in the rice fields of Vietnam, villagers saw helicopters descending like omens, soldiers kicking down doors in the middle of the night, and intelligence units marking homes with chalk before dragging men away. For Thomas, who had spent years rationalizing America's covert strategies, this contradiction tore deeper than ever. The land that promised freedom had built a machinery capable of operating without restraint. Jack spoke about returning home after the war, a home that didn't understand him, didn't want to hear his story, didn't know what to do with men who carried ghosts. He described nights waking up, drenched in sweat, hearing phantom screams, seeing flames even in the darkest rooms. "People think PTSD is fear," he said softly. "It's not. It's guilt that never stops breathing." Thomas saw in Jack the same haunted expression he had seen in Farhad when speaking about his brother, in Mateo when recalling his burned village, in Cancun when remembering Lumumba. Different wars, different continents, but the same wound, human lives fractured by decisions made in rooms they would never enter. And yet, the Phoenix program wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination of everything Thomas had been tracing from Iran to Guatemala to the Congo, a worldview that treated conflicts not as tragedies, but as equations: destroy the infrastructure, break the will, control the territory, win the map. Vietnam wasn't just another intervention, it was the moment the machinery became fully visible, its gears grinding without illusion or subtlety. But as Thomas would later write in his journals, machines don't stop themselves. They only stop when someone decides the cost has become too high. And by the early 70s, America was beginning to feel that cost not only in body counts and headlines, but in the psyche of a nation slowly realizing it had lost something far more intangible: its sense of moral direction. Jack exhaled smoke and stared at the floor. "We thought the war would end when we came home," he said, "but it followed us. It always does." His voice cracked on the final word, and Thomas understood that the war had carved permanent scars into both countries. Vietnam lost millions. America lost a generation of young men and any remaining innocence about the righteousness of its mission. And when the war finally ended, the CIA, bruised, criticized, and uncertain, faced a new question: what comes after a machine like Phoenix? After Vietnam, the agency needed a new mission, and it found one. On a hot summer night in south-central Los Angeles, sometime in the mid-1980s, A grandmother named Evelyn Jackson sat awake by her front window, listening to police sirens cut through the dark. She had lived on that street for nearly 30 years, long enough to remember when children played outside until sunset, when neighbors left their doors unlocked, when the word crack meant nothing more than a sound. Now, every night felt the same. Gunshots in the distance, helicopters overhead, young men disappearing one by one. Evelyn would later ask a question that echoed through the community for decades. How did this happen so fast? Thomas Reed heard her story years later at a community forum organized by local activists. By then, he had already begun to understand that, after Vietnam, the CIA didn't retreat, it adapted. Public scrutiny had forced the agency to abandon visible wars, but it still needed money, leverage, and influence. And so, quietly, a new ecosystem emerged, one that operated through deniability, intermediaries, and shadows, drugs, guns, proxy fighters. The machinery of Covert found a new fuel source. From Evelyn's block, the story widens into the geopolitical architecture of the 1980s. As the Cold War entered its final decade, the US government became obsessed with preventing leftist movements in Latin America, Nicaragua's Contras, right-wing militias in Central America, and various proxy forces across the region needed funding. Congress, wary after Vietnam and Watergate, imposed restrictions, most notably the Boland Amendment limiting direct support. But covert systems rarely stop when laws intervene, they reroute. Investigative reporting in the 1990s, including the work of journalist Gary Webb, raised a deeply unsettling question: whether cocaine trafficking networks connected to Contra supporters were allowed to operate with minimal interference, flooding American cities with drugs, while profits funneled into foreign conflicts. Declassified documents later confirmed that US agencies were aware of drug activity linked to certain anti-communist groups and chose to look the other way. Official statements denied intent, denied coordination, denied responsibility. But awareness alone was enough to fracture trust. For communities like Evely, Ents, intent hardly mattered. The effects were devastating. Crack cocaine tore through black neighborhoods with surgical precision, fueling addiction, violence, mass incarceration, and degenerational trauma. Families collapsed, schools emptied, prisons filled, and as police budgets expanded and sentencing laws hardened, residents began asking a question that would not go away. Was this destruction simply ignored, or was it tolerated for a larger strategic goal? Thomas saw the same pattern he had traced across decades: distant policy decisions producing intimate suffering. In Washington, cocaine was an abstraction, an unfortunate side effect of geopolitical necessity. In Los Angeles, it was a daily reality that buried sons and hollowed out communities. American culture fractured along that line. Trust in government, already weakened by Vietnam, eroded further. People no longer asked whether the system had failed them. They asked whether it had soccer. I fist them. The shadow economy didn't stop at drugs. Arms flowed freely through back channels, moving from US stockpiles into the hands of militias, warlords, and criminal syndicates. Weapons designed of foreign battlefields ended up on American streets. Proxy wars abroad created proxy violence at home. The boundary between foreign policy and domestic consequence dissolved. Evelyn once told Thomas, "We were fighting a war we never signed up for," and she was right. The Cold War, long framed as a struggle overseas, had quietly invaded American neighborhoods. The same logic that justified coups and covert wars now justified silence. If exposure threatened strategy, then exposure itself became the enemy. But secrecy has limits. Files leak, witnesses speak, patterns emerge, and as journalists, activists, and congressional investigators began pulling at loose threads, the shadow economy revealed itself not as a conspiracy of villains, but as a system built on fear, convenience, and moral compromise. Thomas understood Now that the CIA hadn't ignited every fire, it had stood close enough to feel the heat, and often chose not to step back. The stand Americans were left with wasn't simple, and it wasn't comfortable. Did our own government help light the match? But the truth, as Thomas had learned across every chapter of this journey, has a way of leaking out no matter how deeply it's buried. On a quiet November evening, 1986, millions of Americans sat in their living rooms watching the nightly news when a story broke that felt almost unreal. Grainy footage filled the screen. Names, diagrams, arrows pointing between countries no one expected to see connected. Iran, Nicaragua. The White House. For the first time in a generation, shadow world Americans had only sensed was suddenly visible broadcast directly into their homes. Thomas Reed watched in silence, knowing instantly that this was different. This wasn't rum or suspicion. This was exposure across the country. In a modest home in rural Ohio, Margaret Collins sat clutching a photograph of her son, a Marine killed years earlier during what she had been told was a training-related deployment. As the revelations unfolded, she felt a familiar sickness rise in her chest. The reports suggested that secret operations funded illegally, hidden from Congress, denied repeatedly by officials had placed American servicemen in harm's way without public knowledge or consent. They told us he died for freedom. She would later say, why? But they never told us who decided the risk was worth it. From that living room in Ohio, the story widens into the machinery of Iran-Contra. At its core was a simple violation. US officials secretly sold arms to Iran, then considered an enemy, in hopes of securing hostages, and funneled the proceeds to support Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Despite explicit congressional bans, the Boland Amendment had been designed to stop exactly this kind of covert escalation, but instead of stopping, the system adapted. Funds were rerouted, paper trails were erased. Authority was fragmented just enough to maintain plausible deniability. Congressional hearings soon followed, broadcast live on national television. Americans watched officials testify under oath, watched evasive answers collide with documented facts. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North became a household name. Charts were drawn, shredded documents were discussed openly. For the first time, the public didn't just hear that the government might be lying, they watched the process unfold in real time. The contrast was jarring. The confident rhetoric of national security versus the visible strain of officials caught between truth and loyalty. Our families like Margaret's, the hearings felt like betrayal layered upon grief. The anger wasn't just about broken laws, it was about broken trust. Parents realized their children had been deployed into conflicts shaped by secret agendas. Citizens understood that oversight mechanisms had failed not by accident, but by design. The same covert logic that had allowed drugs, guns, and proxy wars to flourish now stood exposed at the highest level of American power. Culturally, Iran-Contra marked a turning point. The post-Vietnam skepticism that once lived at the margins of American society moved into the mainstream. Trust in institutions eroded further. Late-night comedians mocked the scandal. Editorial pages debated whether democracy could survive such deception. And yet, for many Americans, the most unsettling realization was not that wrongdoing had occurred, but that it had been normalized within the system. Thomas Reed recognized the pattern immediately. Iran-Contra wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable collision between secrecy and accountability. Decades of covert doctrine had taught agencies how to operate outside the light, but not how to return when the light finally turned on. The hearings exposed not just individuals, but an entire culture of justification, one where outcomes mattered more than laws, and loyalty to Misi outweighed loyalty to the public. When the scandal faded from headlines, something quietly settled in its place: resignation. Few senior figures faced lasting consequences. Pardons were sued, careers resumed. The system absorbed the shock and moved on. For Margaret, that was the hardest truth to accept, that the machinery responsible for her son's death would continue, largely unchanged. And yet, Iran-Contra left a permanent mark. It proved that secrecy could be challenged, that shadows could be dragged into view, even if only briefly. Americans had seen behind the curtain. They could no longer pretend ignorance. As Thomas watched the hearings conclude, he understood that the Cold War was nearing its end, but the habits it had created were not. The Methodist had survived exposure, the logic had survived scandal, and the shadows were already shifting, preparing to follow new threats into a new era. The Cold War would end, but the shadows would not. On the morning of September 11, 2001, America watched itself change in real time. Office workers froze in front of televisions, parents rushed to halls, strangers held one another on sidewalks as smokes followed the skyline of New York. For a brief moment, the nation was united not by ideology or politics, but by raw fear. Thomas Reedstow, all alone in his living room, staring at the screen, feeling the same sensation he had known decades earlier, the sense that an invisible enemy had crossed a line no one believed could be crossed. In the days that followed, grief hardened into anger, and anger into resolve. America promised itself it would never be caught unprepared again. And so, once more, fear became policy. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance in the name of prevention. Guantanamo Bay became a legal limbo, where the rules of justice bent under the weight of urgency. Enhanced interrogation techniques are phrased carefully, chosen revived questions the country thought it had buried after Vietnam and Iran-Contra. How much freedom could be surrendered for safety? And who decided when the trade was worth it? For many Americans, these measures felt necessary, even righteous. The trauma was too fresh, the threat too real. But for Thomas, the pattern was unmistakable. He had seen this cycle before. Fear justified secrecy, secrecy justified power, and power drifted beyond accountability. The faces changed, the enemy changed, the logic did not. Families of detainees waited years without answers. Why? Whistleblowers spoke and vanished into exile. Ordinary citizens slowly realized that the surveillance meant to protect them was also watching them. The paradox of modern America came into focus. Nation founded on liberty now wrestling with how much of it could survive in an age of terror. As the years passed, the urgency faded, but the systems remained. Cameras stayed on, databases grew. The shadows did not retreat, they adapted. And Thomas understood that this was not a new chapter, but the continuation of a long story, one that began with fear, repeated itself through secrecy, and endured because it was never fully confronted. In the age of terror, the shadows grew darker, and America was left with the same question it had been asking since the Cold War began. How much of itself was it willing to lose to feel safe?